Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Reading Into Culture podcast. My name's Zara.
And I'm Chris. Hey.
And we're here with Caio, who wrote a prose piece whose name I shall not attempt to pronounce. Would you like to tell us, first of all, the title of your piece and tell us a little bit about yourself, Caio?
Yes, so the title of the piece is Lições do Fantasmo, Vovô, which roughly translates to lessons from the ghost of your grandfather. And a little bit about myself. So I am a graduate student in the MFA program of fiction at Syracuse University. Right now I live in Syracuse with my wife and my dog, whose name is Bagel. It's very important, the dog's name. And I write primarily fiction. I've also dabbled in nonfiction and poetry. And yeah, I tend to write a lot about trans stuff since I'm a trans man, queer issues. I'm Latino, Brazilian on my mother's side. And yeah, I feel like that covers the basics.
Amazing. How would you kind of describe your story and history as a writer, and what's your story with writing?
Yeah, well, so I've been writing a long time, but I feel like I only started really taking myself seriously as a writer when I got into my 30s. That's when I started trying to get better at it and reading more widely, and sort of submitting my short stories places, things like that. And I think because I started getting serious about it later in life, I used to have a little bit of an imposter syndrome about that, which I'm trying to drop recently. But I do think that being a writer in your 30s, it's a lot easier than trying to do it as a younger person, at least speaking personally, because you just kind of have more self-confidence in general. And that's one thing that I think has helped my writing. I didn't really get into writing through, I guess, what I would think of as a traditional way. I didn't major in English in college. I sort of did college later than most of my peers also. And yeah, that was something I used to feel sort of weird about. But now I feel like my life experience has really helped me with my writing. And I think I have a perspective now when it comes to writing, and especially when it comes to incorporating personal stuff into my writing, that I really didn't have when I was younger. And so, yeah, right now I'm sort of in the middle of my graduate program. We'll see what happens after I graduate. But yeah, I feel like that covers it.
It's amazing. I've actually had a lot of writers, in addition, who have kind of come to writing late or have kind of a non-traditional approach to writing. I think this kind of 18-year-old do an English literature degree, and then maybe do a master's in creative writing. That doesn't happen that much, really. I think most people who write like that aren't like that. So most people are non-traditional,
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think it's sort of like a false idea that we have of the perfect trajectory. But I think writing is one of those things where there's not really a one trajectory that leads you to it or leads you to success doing it. And especially now that I've met so many other writers in my program, it's helped me realize oh yeah, the way I came to this is not so unusual. I do feel like I'm a little old to be in grad school sometimes, but on the other hand, it's giving me a few years of not having to work a 9 to 5. So
no, that's true. Yeah, you're not that old. And we studied with someone who was who just recently retired and was 65 or something, and that was pretty cool.
Oh, that's so inspiring, honestly.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about the kind of literature that you like to read and that has influenced you as a writer?
Can I just jump in there? In this piece
Sure.
as well, there's a lot of writers mentioned.
That's true
as well. So I think that could also maybe be a bit of a way in.
Yes, definitely. The writers that I mentioned in the piece, like Roberto Bolaño, Raymond Carver, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, David Foster Wallace, those are all definitely writers that I feel like have influenced me in one way or the other. I always have a hard time figuring out, okay, how much of the writers that I read are showing up in my writing. Like there's not really a one-to-one correspondence. Maybe someone other than me could like read it and let me know. But I sort of like put those writers in this piece because they're all male writers that have, I feel like masculinity is like very important in their work. But I also feel like Zadie Smith is a writer that I've really loved for a long time. And I think her writing has really influenced how I write about people and people's sort of like psychology and culture. Virginia Woolf is another like big influence. I think the way she writes like people's interior minds. I mean, I'm always hoping that I can approach that level, maybe someday, but yeah, so my influences, they're a little bit all over the place. I do really love reading Latin American authors. And as far as like contemporary fiction, I try to read a lot of like trans literature. Tori Peters and Jackie S. They're two of my favorites. Also really love Jean Thornton. So yeah, like I said, kind of all over the place, and I really have no idea how much those influences are like legible in what I actually write, but they're always kind of back there in my mind.
No, totally. No, it's rarely that way that you kind of steal something from someone and then can put it in your piece exactly like that.
Yeah.
Okay, well then I think without further ado, if you're ready, would you like to read the piece for us?
Sure, yeah. Just drink some water first.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Lições do seu fantasma vovô. Pois é, às vezes coisas fizer claro when you become a ghost. You see in new ways, novo jeito. My language skills have been slipping, Portuguese overtaking English since I died. Brazil tries to pull me back, though I continue to love Ronald Reagan. That will never change. I never did love Hitler, despite what Minha Filha, my daughter, thought when she discovered a copy of Mein Kampf among my possessions. I read that book out of morbid curiosity. Like most men of my generation, I was compelled by the war. Toward the end of my life, World War II books were the only ones that held my interest. Looking back, I suspect that my mother's ghost, her Jewish blood, another secret, meus filhos descobrados só depois meu morto, then judged me in death for hiding this fact from them, compelled me to purchase it. That would have been the kind of dark joke she, minha mãe, would have liked. Mein Kampf and my Jewish ancestry were discovered close together, por meus filhos, a link thus imagined between the two. Elas imaginam. Fascismo secreto, a bleak byproduct of internalized self-hatred. He voted Republican despite being Latino, elas disseram de mim, shaking their heads. It makes a sad amount of sense that he looked up to Hitler despite being Jewish. Mentiras. I tell you the truth now. Eu me amava na vida. I carried myself com orgulho, pride, nunca hated myself, never. E por que fantasma mentiria? What reason do I have to lie to you? Prometo, I did not read that book as a Hitler fan. Às vezes, coisas fizeram mais fácil, easier to accept. Por exemplo, my granddaughter becoming my grandson. I was dead by then, haunting the family while Adriana called around to introduce himself as Adriano. He was relieved that I hadn't lived to see this. She knew I would have expressed disgust, like her uncle, meu filho. Carlos e eu, embora tenhamos brigado por muitas coisas, exchanging punches in the last years of my life like we hadn't since he was a teenager, nonetheless shared certain beliefs, the right beliefs. He followed me to death not long after being disgusted by Adriano's identity. Mas quem sabe? My timeline could be wrong. The years blur when you are dead. De qualquer forma, nunca encontrei o fantasma de meu filho. I can't find him, e não sei. I don't know where his ghost is hiding. Perhaps he is hiding from me, fearing a rematch, now that my ghost has taken the form of my body at its strongest and most virile. Ghost stories inevitably grow circular. I cannot tell a story straightforward, particularmente em inglês. Ainda assim, I'm getting there. Como Adriano, I have come to appreciate having one grandson, no granddaughters. It helps that Adriano has been working out. No grandson of mine should have skinny weakling arms. Verdade, my fitness obsession did not grant me long life, though our strangely mutual obsession has helped my ex-wife, aquela vaca, outlive me. I remember all those years we spent doing resentful and furious yoga on opposite sides of Greater Los Angeles. Her on the Disney side, me in Glendale, trying to co-parent while hating each other's guts. Verdade, I expected all that yoga to help me live forever, or at least into my 90s. Como aquela vaca, a vovó de my grandchildren. Mas não deu certo para vovô. Cancer got me early. Okay, sim, Adriano, I was saying. Adriano is a man now, and I'm proud my line ends with a grandson. A trans neta would be a different story, né? Even with my ghostly understanding, I would send todo de minha furia fantasmagórica, haunting to the best of my malevolent abilities. If he'd been born Adriano, then put on lipstick and declared, Eu sou Adriana. Now, longe demais, a bridge too far. It gets boring spending all your ghostly hours searching for Ronald Reagan on the astral plane. So the other day I tired of haunting his presidential library and drifted over to Syracuse to check in on Adriano. Look at all the markers of masculinity he has achieved. A beautiful white wife, a dog, biceps I can stand to look at, a non-shameful bench press. I care less for his literary achievements, but I suppose I am happy for him in his MFA program, studying os grandes homens machistas, revering Roberto Bolaño, Raymond Carver, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, even that rascal David Foster Wallace. I've run into him haunting Syracuse too. We've played tennis together. At least male neto reads male authors. Today, I haunted a corner as Adriano argued in the classroom, defending some book about immigrants, a book I'm sure I would have hated. Immigration stories always paint us as pussified weaklings, not as virile characters possessed of patriotic spirit. I was still alive when Adriana then, was getting his undergrad degree, and back then she would have succumbed to emotion in any debate, perhaps even cried girlish tears. But now, empowered by testosterone, he articulated himself sem emoção, sem fraqueza feminina, with humor and confidence, but no feminine quaver in his voice. He won the debate as well as the respect of his male classmates and professor. They listened as they would to any man. He glanced my way as the discussion moved on, como se ele me visto, meeting my eyes, sensing my presence. Adriano, I wish I had lived to teach you what you won't let yourself learn about manhood. Há muitas lições que você e sua mente fraca, your weak mind with its stubborn solidarity with the weaker sex, will never let yourself touch, tal como how horny women get when you're the only man in their yoga class, how to cheat on your wife without caring when you get caught, how to throw a punch or fire a gun. You're scared for your rights, como travesti. So you've wondered if you should learn how to use a gun. But when Carlos se mató, shooting himself in the head en morte masculina, you decided you could never allow yourself to own a gun. I would have scoffed at this and told you to man up when I was alive. Mas como fantasma, I can see where you're coming from. I am in no hurry to see you join me during a depressive episode. Ainda não encontrou seu tio, meu filho. I cannot find my son among the dead, and I have searched. Como se fantasma, I am less guarded than in life. I can admit that the disappointment of losing Carlos perhaps led me to Adriano, the last man whose veins carry my blood. I followed Adriano as he walked home after class. He was thinking of me, Gisetta forma, he was thinking about macho men he did not want to become. He was troubled by the respect he'd so easily commanded. He was looking a gift horse in the mouth. De cavallo dado não se olho dente, Adriano, you pussy-ass bitch. Sim, fantasmos can pick up slang, even those as old but virile as me. Adriano was thinking of me, Mein Kampf hidden in my bedroom closet, and the Jewish ancestry that went undiscovered until his mother got her DNA tested. He was thinking of self-hatred's warping power and shadow selves. Himeos Deus, serio? He was thinking about whether or not he was still a good feminist. Para comiso, neto. Don't ruin this for me. I dismiss his theories on my self-hatred, but Jung's shadow self. Isso está interessante. Do ghosts have shadow selves? Talvez, mas não. I have no Jewish shadow self. Isso vou negar, sempre, forever deny. If travestis have shadow selves, is the shadow their born gender or the gender they become? Or is it always a man, always machismo coming out on top or from beneath? Adriano, you're smarter than you used to be, and your feminist mentors will tell you this is because you have now seen gender from both sides. But as a ghost, como seu fantasma, I will tell you what I know to be true. You are wise because men are wiser than women. You are now superior. E você vai ouvir o meu voz. You will hear my voice in your ear as you walk, with its echoes of Ronald Reagan and Mein Kampf and Roberto Bolaño and David Foster Wallace, whether you wish to hear me or not.
Wow, thank you so much.
Amazing.
Thank you.
There's so much to talk about in this piece. And so many themes and I don't even know where to start. But I feel like the obvious place to start is probably to talk about masculinity. That is probably the main theme of this piece, and the kind of proud, manly grandfather, and then the trans masculine grandson who is reckoning with the almost like inherited sexism of the male gender that must be a very complex thing to think about, because, you know, as a trans man, you would be kind of at once the victim and the perpetrator of sexism in a way, which, I mean, everybody is, even women. But I don't know. What do you think about this in this piece?
Yeah, well, this piece did come out of me thinking a lot about sort of inherited masculinity and how when you become a trans man, I mean, it's very complicated because you're still a member of an oppressed minority, and, you know, your rights are still sort of under attack. But depending on how well you can sort of fit into traditional masculine roles, there is also some privilege that you sometimes, I mean, no one really holds up a sign that says, like, we're treating you better now because you're a man. But so, like, you kind of have to go off of like subtext usually, and you usually don't know 100% like whether this would be different if you were not appearing as a man, like in a certain situation. Kind of similar, honestly, to when I was living as a woman and I wouldn't know, like, okay, do I feel disrespected in this situation because I'm a woman, or does it have nothing to do with that, you know? But suddenly it's like you're experiencing it from the other side at the same time as you are also experiencing transphobia, the kind of misogyny that is still directed at trans men. So it's all this kind of like stew that's going on in your head. And I started thinking about it from the perspective of my family, because this is a very sort of like autofictional piece. The grandfather in this story is sort of inspired by my own Vovô. who died a long time ago before he transitioned. And he is an interesting person to think about as a fictional character for me because he was so politically conservative when he was alive. And then after he died, my mom's side of the family did discover that his mom was Jewish, which was not something he had ever been open about. He was just the sort of like classic archetype of Latino machismo. And so it's interesting to think about what he would think of my transition if he were alive, but to think about it not in some sort of like tragic woe is me way, but like how to find the humor in that. And what kind of like how his perspective maybe would have like shifted in death, and especially kind of like the differences between a very masculine man, how maybe he would have found it easier to accept someone transitioning to a man than the opposite, because I think that is something that we see with a lot of trans misogyny, that I think there are some people out there that they have an easier time accepting a man, any man, even a trans man, than they do trans women or even cis women, because the misogyny runs that deep. So that's kind of what I was thinking about when I was writing it. And masculinity is just one of those things that I think I will probably be writing about forever, because it's so strange. Just on every level, the way it's constructed, the way you can find like positive things inside it. All of those writers that I mentioned in the piece, they're writers that I love, but I do think sexism shows up in sort of like different ways in all of their work, which was something that I really wrestled with when I was reading them, those writers, like as a woman, like, okay, I love these works, but I can also tell that they're written by men that like, would these men respect me if I were to meet them face to face? And as a trans man, you still wonder that, but you wonder about it in a slightly different way. I sort of ran out of that thought, but
That's very interesting. I want to pick up on that idea of generation, or this kind of generational perspective slightly, because one of the things that I find particularly fascinating about this piece is this the Jewish mother of the grandfather. There seems to be a kind of relationship between the grandfather and the ghost of the Jewish mother, in the same way that there is a relationship between the grandfather and the grandson in this piece. So, for example, she made him buy Mein Kampf, is what it is. I can't find the exact quote. So that implies a kind of ghostly influence. And then that was making me think about this. That would be, if it's kind of nuanced in the piece, but you could maybe consider these ghosts as a kind of in relation to the shadow self. So I guess where I'm going with this, a kind of generational shadow self. So I guess my first question is, could you tell us a little bit more about the Jungian idea of the shadow self? And then my second question would be, to what extent is that changed by this generational aspect?
Yeah, well, so I'm definitely not an expert on anything related to like Jungian psychology, but my understanding of the shadow self and the understanding that sort of went into this piece is that the shadow self is sort of the parts of yourself that you repress in order to fit in with society, and especially in order to fit in with society's like dominant morals. So, depending on, I guess, how you're interacting with society and what kind of person, the kind of face you want to present to the world, maybe that shadow self is very amoral. Maybe it reflects the things in yourself that you have like really repressed, like sexuality or gender. a repressed relationship to like your own ethnicity, like that kind of thing. And I'm really interested in the idea of like, well, okay, if we all have a shadow self, like if you're trans, is that shadow self going to be like the gender that you repressed for a long time and then eventually became? Like if we actually, go all the way and envision the shadow self as like almost a separate person that you're living with, like is it the gender that you become? Is it the gender then that you were born as, that you try to reject as you transition? Or because we're also affected by the patriarchy, is the shadow self like kind of always a man because masculinity is this thing that is sort of like getting in the way for almost everyone? And I don't know the answer to that question. But I do think the shadow self really resonates with the idea of being haunted. And haunting, I mean, I feel like most ghost stories, there's like an aspect of some kind of like relation that you have with the ghost, even if it's not like a direct family member. I mean, that's the way I was playing with it in the piece, but maybe it's a person that represents a family member or represents like some part of you that you've been divorced from. But so I liked the idea that the grandfather was haunted by the ghost of his mother, kind of similarly to how the grandson is being haunted, but they're kind of like going on opposite political poles, right? Because he's like trying to present this politically conservative, super macho face to the world. He's being haunted by the ghost of his Jewish mother, whereas like the trans grandson, who is like trying to be a good feminist and all of that, is like haunted by the really misogynist grandfather.
Yeah, I think that's I think that really comes across. I think that's very interesting indeed. It's like this idea of the shadow self. I guess to me, it comes across to me like the grandfather shadow self is the Jewishness, and then that is manifested as a kind of shadow ancestor. As a shadow self, and then Aviano shadow self is this kind of specific right-wing machismo, this kind of idea, this kind of obnoxious masculinity, so to say. And then that shadow self is then manifested again as an ancestor, as the grandfather. And this kind of interpolation of the shadow self, not as the self, but as a parent or a grandparent, is something I find really, really fascinating. Because that is really, I don't know, I just find that fascinating. I don't know, I don't quite know what to say about it, but this kind of oppressed nature of ourselves is either not ourselves or is only ourselves through a kind of familial relationship. I find that because that is very true, that like the way our parents and our grandparents give us very bad habits often, give us very bad ways of thinking very often, as well as good ways of thinking, that we then as adults need to repress, perhaps.
We're almost maybe more averse to them than an equal kind of opinion that is kind of neutral to us,
Right. And I think what I was going to say about the shadow selves is that I think I'm very drawn to the idea that you can't ignore the shadow self, that if you ignore it, that it is going to come out in ways that you can't control, or that it's going to come out in ways that in actions that you take that you didn't even realize what was like subconsciously motivating those actions. I think it is related to the idea of an inheritance, of generational trauma that gets kind of passed down and sort of repressed. And in my family, I mean, I didn't really have a relationship with my Vovô where I really knew him before he died, because he was such a right-wing guy. My mom just like never wanted us to like have a close relationship with him. And so I guess in a way, writing this piece was sort of like imagining a relationship that was never quite there. But it's like, even if I don't have too many really good memories of him, or even if I found out more about him after he died than I knew about him when he was alive, I still feel like there is an inheritance there that will probably never be fully articulated, or that I'll never fully uncover, because, you know, he passed stuff down to my mom and her sisters. She passed stuff down to me. And it's all in there somewhere. And I guess my only hope is that, you know, through confronting these elements and sort of like bringing them to light and not ignoring them, then that is maybe a way to not just be unconsciously controlled by these things.
Very, very interesting. I think another thing that is also, if we talk about kind of repressed things, another thing that this grandfather seems to kind of repress is, you know, generally emotions and weakness, and this kind of shows up here as the grief for his son, so the grandson's uncle, and there's I think these are the bits that emotionally hit me the hardest when he's talking about I cannot find my son among the dead, and I have searched. I am less guarded than in life. I can admit that the disappointment of losing Carlos perhaps led me to Adriano, the last man whose veins carry my blood. And I'm kind of thinking about this whole piece, and this whole kind of masculinity that is presented here reminds me a lot about reminds me a lot of The Will to Change by Bell Hooks, and I feel like I talk about this book all the time, so but I cannot have a whole conversation without bringing up this book. But it reminded me of the sentence, "Disconnection is not fallout from traditional masculinity. Disconnection is masculinity," and I feel like especially connection between two men is the most frowned upon within masculinity. And so this relationship between a father and son here is kind of there is so much grief from the father towards the son, but it's kind of not allowed to exist. And he admits, I have been looking for my son. I'm trying to find him. I'm literally trying to connect in some way, but he's not here. I can't find him. I can't connect with him. And but then kind of just when you think, oh, you know, maybe this could lead to some emotional insight, kind of the patriarchy and masculinity wins out again. And the solution here is, okay, where's another man that can carry my blood? And the solution still is not emotional vulnerability and connection, but it is kind of masculine pride. Yeah. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Oh, well, I'm so happy to hear that you got all that from the story, because I mean, that was somewhere in my mind while I was writing, and you always hope that people will sort of pick up what you put down. But yeah, I love your interpretation of it, because that's definitely what I was trying to do. I think with the sort of father-son relationship is that, you know, they were fighting all of the time when both of these characters were alive, and then in death, even though the grandfather has sort of realized what that connection meant to him, it's ultimately too late. And the only way he knows to try and to make a new connection is by, you know, his warped way of trying to love the grandson is this attempt to pass on lessons of misogyny. And to sort of like haunt the grandson by saying, like, this is my legacy, this is your inheritance, like whether you want it or not. And so I do think it's sort of sad in the piece that, you know, the uncle, even though the piece isn't really about him, it's like he was this, you know, another like macho, politically conservative guy who ultimately killed himself. And that's like, even though the grandfather is sad about that, he's still like, well, it's a macho way to die. Like, if you've got to go. And that the uncle sort of represents like the end point of this sort of like really destructive kind of masculinity that can't allow for like real connection, excuse me, or any like softness in relationships.
Yeah, that's such a good point. But I think it's so lovely then that the father kind of thinks about his son this way after he has died in this horrific way, but then when he thinks about his grandson, he's like, oh, actually, you better not. It's still kind of like, it's a nice moment of, well, not just yet. I don't want that for you.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted the grandfather's ghost to be someone who is sort of learning. I mean, maybe learning very slowly how to be a different kind of person, now that he's dead and has all of this time on his hands. And that, he's never going to get to the point where he's like completely evolved or reading bell hooks or has completely lost all of this like baggage that he has in life. But he is able to at least see what happened to his son and then see his grandson and say like, actually, I don't want that for you. Like, and I'm going to think something different now than I would have thought about it when I was alive.
I think that really comes across the kind of the ghost's capacity to learn. You make a comment somewhere about how even ghosts can learn slang. And it's about the negative slang, but also at some point there's the use of the depressive episode, which I found particularly striking because it doesn't really fit to my imagination of what this grandfather would have said about alive. So it implies, and it seems like a relatively contemporary phrase to me. I'm not a scholar of its history, and therefore, like, the use of that phrase, and there's a few other phrases that do something similar, like, they really show this kind of, this capacity for the ghost to learn, the ghost to change, the ghost to kind of become more socially aware, I guess you could phrase it. And I think that really is quite effective. I think that really shows that, what you're saying, that there's a kind of, the ghost is still the kind of asshole that he is, but there's a kind of capacity to understand things that is still there, that I find really striking.
Yeah, well, I had a lot of fun writing like from the perspective of a villain with this piece, but at the same time, I didn't want him to just be like one-dimensional. And I do feel like, I have to believe that people do have this capacity to learn and grow. Even the most bigoted people, like maybe they're never going to get 100% there. But I think most people, especially when confronted with like personal relationships with the kinds of people that they've been taught to hate, usually they can grow and change just a little bit. I mean, even if they don't change the way they vote or whatever, even if they like never turn into the kind of people that like I personally would want to like befriend, I don't think most people are just 100% evil psychopaths. I think, well, you find in them capacity to learn and grow, even if it's just a little bit, even if it's like not as much as you want. So that's kind of what I was going for with the grandfather. Like, I didn't want him to just be like this soulless evil guy. I wanted to write about the things about him that were messed up or needed to change, but I wanted to like give him some seeds of humanity, like at the same time.
I think that what I also really like, I don't know, what really strikes me about this piece is the kind of the perspective, because it is written from the perspective of the grandfather, but especially towards the end, it almost feels like it shifts perspectives, or it shifts kind of like where we're actually coming from, where the thoughts are actually coming from, because we are kind of hearing the grandson's thoughts in the end and the fears, and in the beginning it's the grandfather who's like, oh, all the feminism and everything, and then towards the end it's this really raw, vulnerable section where Adriano is kind of thinking about manhood and not wanting to become a certain way, and struggle with the respect he'd so easily commanded, and it seems like the grandfather is kind of in Adriano's head, and Adriano is kind of in the grandfather's head. There's kind of like a symbiosis of the two, and they're both kind of scared of each other, but also influenced by each other, and also can kind of understand the other. And it really seems like there is a perspective shift in the piece, even though in the words there isn't, but from the what we actually hear about, it seems like we are actually we end up closer to Adriano than we start.
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't think I was consciously trying to do that while writing it. But I think the way the piece ended up, just because of the things I wanted to talk about, were so much of, in Adriano's head, like not just the ghost's head. And, I wanted the ghost to be giving him these lessons. And so for that, you sort of like, Adriano does sort of need to become less opaque to the reader, and you sort of like need to see him not just the way the ghost sees him. And at the same time, I wanted to sort of indicate the ways that this ghost character was vulnerable, the ways that he does have this self-hatred, even if it's not something that he would ever like directly admit to the reader. And so I do think because of that, there is sort of like a perspective shift, or almost like a melding that happens, because like, the ghost would never think of himself as someone who maybe has this like shadow self, or has maybe been warped by self-hatred, but Adriano is thinking about that, and Adriano is sort of like recognizing that about his Vovô. So yeah, I think that really just came out of like what I decided I wanted to talk about with these characters, and so it sort of like became, both of them kind of needed to become more vulnerable to the reader in that sense.
Yeah, and I think that works really, really well.
I think that really comes across. And this idea of this kind of journey of vulnerability, I find really effective. I think they use a delightful phrase, ghost stories. The ghost story, and I find that very, very, more a delightful expression.
I think we should generally talk about the humor. No, you can say what you want to say,
let's talk
but
about
that's
the humor.
Definitely a big, especially the humor around death. It seems to take death so lightly, and it seems to really, it's like the years blur when you are dead, and cancer got me early, and all these things just seem so, I'm dead.
I think I did not read that book as a Hitler fan. Is a truly hysterical son.
Yeah, I think the humor just really came out of like me trying to write in this voice, and sort of the voice of like a character who is trying to charm the reader, but at the same time is sort of like going to be grotesque to the reader at the same time. I mean, if someone is telling you like, oh, I didn't read the book as a Hitler fan, don't worry. That's not true at all, And then I don't know, I had a lot of fun with the voice in this piece. I think because he is like such a villain, but at the same time, he thinks of himself as this like charming ladies' man. And, a lot of those contradictions just came out of like hearing stories about my Vovô and the way he would like treat people and like treat women especially. And, in Brazilian culture, we tend to like joke about everything. Like no topic is off limits, like not even death. And so I think when I was thinking about like the Brazilian side of my family and, trying to write in Portuguese, I think a lot of that just kind of like naturally found its way into the piece.
Oh, that's so lovely that there's like this culture in there in a way that is so, so subtle and so like, just... like a real, actual cultural influence in the way that humor is used. That's really cool.
No, totally. I think like one problem I find him charming despite myself. I can't help but
good.
I can't help but like him a bit,
Charming, yeah.
Like I don't know. There's a kind of, I don't know. this journey is so interesting in the text. And the way that I see it, at least, is the kind of, this kind of fascist patriarchal idea, maybe fascist is a bit strong, quasi-fascist idea of like bloodline. No, I don't mean him, I mean generally, of like bloodlines, the idea that the role of society is the kind of passing on of a specific superior genetic legacy, and this focus on his virility as a ghost, which is the idea of a virile ghost. Nothing could be less virile than a ghost. So it's this kind of this clinging to a fascistic patriarchal idea of a masculine bloodline that is the world has left him behind. That is no longer existent, and with the death of the son, that is no longer possible. And then, so in this kind of pathetic defeat of this fascistic patriarchal idea of a masculine bloodline, the grandfather has to turn to a kind of ersatz patriarch in Adriano, which he normally would despise, but because it's the closest thing to what he would see as a man that there's left, he kind of has to do it. And in this kind of pathetic movement to kind of cling on to this patriarchal fascistic idea, even with a deeply unfascistic unpatriarchal thing like a trans person, in doing that, he then learns to actually understand this trans man, and that I find it very touching. There's an irony to it, in clinging to the patriarchy. He begins to understand the limits of it somehow.
That's like the opposite of how I read it.
Interesting.
Yeah, well, I think irony is a good word for it. I mean, there's something I find kind of inherently funny about the idea of someone for whom his bloodline is really important, and he really likes the idea of passing on his genes, sort of latching on to this trans man grandson is kind of like a last resort, and then through that finding his way into acceptance in this like very backwards manner. I don't know. I mean, there's no way for me to know how this particular relative, if he would have like felt that way if he had lived, and I don't know if I care that he would have. But the idea of like playing with that in fiction was both funny to me and kind of like, I don't know if sweet is the right word for it, but I think it humanizes him, that he sort of like goes on this journey in this almost like backwards sort of way.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, this is still a piece of fiction, and this character isn't real, and it's not, at the end of the day, a real person that goes through something real. It's very very fictional. It's about literally a ghost, and so it's this kind of story of this person's move towards some sort of understanding doesn't necessarily have to reflect how a person actually would approach it. And I think the humor is and this kind of exaggeration. I don't know, it seems like so exaggerated, how much this person loves masculinity, that it's like it's so funny that almost it makes it funnier that this is a complete I don't know, laughing stock almost, as a caricature of someone who's masculine. I think that works really well.
Totally.
Caricature is a good word for it. Yes, that's what I was going for.
No, I totally agree with that, and I think that kind of brings out one of the tensions in the piece that I think is really wonderful. This, like, he is a ridiculous, vile caricature, but he's giving lessons, and those lessons are actually quite helpful at some points. I would say it is a kind of
interesting.
You need like, if you want to be a man, you need to know how to do that, right? And that's true of boys, and that's true.
How to do what? You mean?
How to be a man.
Oh, I see.
And then you need some way to do that, and this is a genuine, sincere advice about how one can better socially perform masculinity, which is genuinely sincere and somehow helpful. I feel like even if it is a negative idea of masculinity, if the goal is to socially perform masculinity, the advice is in some points helpful. And I find that like he understands it. He understands what it is to be a man within a certain view. And therefore his perspective on how one does that is very, I don't know. I don't see the lessons in the title as necessarily completely ironic. There's a kind of, and that's the tension in the piece, is a kind of being a man, but performing masculinity, whether trans or otherwise, requires a social model that is very complicated. And even if you are being a man in a way that is, even if you're trying to be a man and not be a traditional sexist patriarchal man, you still need a model, and you still need to kind of engage with masculinity. And so that is deeply problematic. And this advice, these lessons really, I think, highlight that, the problematic nature of that. It's, I guess, what I would say.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that that's the thing about sort of like transitioning to become a man is you're sort of transitioning into at least an archetype that was your oppressor when you were a woman, and in some ways still is, right? Because like when you're trans, you still have to navigate within the patriarchy. I mean, in a way, I don't think it's like that dissimilar than from like being a cis man, because like when you're a cis man, you still have to, in some ways, other cis men like are still your oppressors, no matter like where you were born or like live on that food chain. But I think when you're a trans man, you are sort of like, you're looking at those lessons from the outside in first, and then you get to like think about them as someone who like embodies that, if that makes sense. And I do think like one of the sad/funny things about the piece is that like Adriano, he's trying to be a man, but he is not trying to be the same kind of man that like his grandfather was. He's the kind of man that like earnestly wants to be like a good feminist. And so like, yes, he still needs like a model. He still needs like someone to help him figure out what that looks like. But jury is out on whether or not his ghost grandpa is really going to be able to get there.
No, absolutely.
I think. Oh
no, go.
I think we should talk about another pretty obvious thing about this piece, which is the language. And I think I am very impressed because the first time I read this piece, obviously, I didn't look up what anything meant. And I still felt like I could understand everything, because you kind of managed to kind of repeat a few things in English that make it clear, and then often you kind of use words that have like a Latin root, so you kind of understand what it means anyway. And I think that's very skillfully done. For this podcast, we looked up all the translations, and I think that that is obviously for us it's good and helpful, but I do think that it works without. And I wanted to ask you about how you kind of went about doing this and making sure that this would not only appeal to bilingual readers, and if it influenced your word choices, and if it influenced, just how this piece was written.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so I would say that wanting to write something that utilized a lot of Portuguese words was like one of my main motivations in starting to write this. Actually, it was like, okay, what kind of like situation can I come up with that would allow me to write Portuguese and English? And then everything kind of like flowed out of that. And I've written other pieces that used a lot of Portuguese in which I did not feel like it would be in character for that narrator to explain what they meant or, provide an English translation or anything like that. And I found writing that way a lot harder because then you want to like feel like you're pulling the English speaking reader along, even if you're not like, even if you can't like hold their hand, right, with like translations or anything like that. And in this piece, I was like, well, I feel like I can justify providing some like English translations or making things a little easier to understand, because this is someone who is sort of like earnestly trying to communicate with the English speaking world and is sort of really trying to speak in English, but like keeps backsliding because his memory is, because he's a ghost. That was like my justification. I was like, oh, he's a ghost. Whatever.
It works.
It's all getting mixed up in there.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, so I had to go through pretty carefully, and I think, I maybe left some phrases here and there that like might be trickier to translate. Or that he doesn't like immediately explain. But for the most part, I think I tried to have him sort of like explain what he meant, or have the prose pull you along in such a way that if you didn't like pause to look something up, it wouldn't like mess up your reading experience, or like it wouldn't be impossible to understand. But I mean, ultimately, this was a piece where I felt like writing in Portuguese and English was important. And the flow of the Portuguese was sort of like important to me as I was writing it. Yeah, I don't know. I really like incorporating Spanish and Portuguese into my fiction, even though I primarily write in English, just because I think like those are beautiful languages. And I always find it really exciting as a reader when a writer is pulling in other languages. I just finished reading The Last Samurai by Helen DeWitt, which is a book that, a huge chunk of it is about, she's sort of making this argument that like, wouldn't it be amazing if writers used other languages the way painters used paints, like pulling in other languages because they express a certain feeling, the way a paint color expresses a certain feeling, even if it's not like hard to understand or something like that. And I am not really good enough at learning languages to be able to use languages like quite at that level, but I think that would be the dream, is to be able to use these other words or use this language almost in an impressionistic sort of way.
Yeah, and it was really lovely hearing you read it, because that gives it a whole different kind of feel than just seeing the words on the page, and it's almost like a poem where if especially the poet themselves read it out, then it can really make it come alive, and I really felt that here as well.
Good, thank you.
My question would be, so if languages are like colors, what they communicate certain emotions, what kind of, how does Portuguese differ from English? I guess just looking at the two that we have here.
Oh, good question. So I think Portuguese is an incredibly like musical language. I mean, this is sort of terrible, but the joke that my mother would always make is she would say things like, I cannot picture, a Brazilian doctor doing surgery, or like a Brazilian lawyer like arguing a case, because like the language is just so musical and fun, and it's like hard to imagine in a serious scenario. And I'm like, okay, that's sort of there. You've got some like internalized something there, but I also like I can understand what she meant, because it is like, especially you hear it's. I mean, I am not like a native speaker, so my pronunciation is like very bad, but like, I mean, you hear it sung or even just like spoken, especially like when I hear like Brazilian literature, like being read aloud, like in Portuguese, it's just got this gorgeous like rhythm and cadence to it. And I think the vowel sounds are so like particular. And that is something that like I really love about that language. And I think that it conveys passion in a way that I can't really articulate, but that to me is like subtly different from how English does it. And obviously I love the English language, or I wouldn't be writing in English, but I think Portuguese, it just offers something that is so musical and emotional to me, and I think that that's why I keep reaching for it in my writing.
Amazing.
Interesting.
Does anyone have any further comments or things to explore in the piece?
Yeah, anything very important that we haven't mentioned?
I don't think so. I feel like we covered it. I'm really honored that that we had such an in-depth conversation about it, because it's not that long of a piece. But
no, it's so rich. I think it's so rich. There's so much there.
Yeah, we're kind of both primarily writers of poetry, and so like poetry is talk for twice as long as about a 4-line poem. You know? kind of the background we're coming from. So this is not that long about a very long piece from my point of view.
That's true. I guess it's all relative.
I guess. So I would like to ask you our final question that we ask everybody, which is, from your perspective, what do you think is the place that writing and literature have in the kind of wider society and in our culture at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question, because it does feel like, especially like in the last, I would say, couple years or so, with the sort of like unignorable rise of AI, it's really felt like literature has been under threat. I mean, I've sort of like had that feeling hanging over me my whole life, because, you know, literature, you know, with the rise of TV and the internet and YouTube or whatever, literature doesn't really have the same, it doesn't occupy the same space in our culture as it did maybe in the 20th century. But I also don't think that literature is ever going to be unimportant, because I think that what people get out of reading poetry and prose, it just can't be replicated in other forms. You can really get into a character's mind in writing and through language in ways that you can't watching a movie or a TV show or someone on YouTube. And I also think that literature, I mean, nothing can really beat it for articulating ideas and expressing those ideas and getting them out to a general populace. I mean, even if you look at like a genre like self-help books, I mean, there's a reason that you don't see those ideas like in movies or whatever. It's like when people want to improve themselves or figure out what's going wrong in their lives, like they reach for books, they reach for words and language. And you know, there's a lot of self-help books that I don't particularly approve of, but I think that impulse to reach for the written word when you really need something explained to you, I think that that's pretty just like generally like a human thing. And I think novelists and poets are sort of reacting to that with what we make. And I think that, like, I guess all of that is a very long-winded way of saying that I think literature is one of my favorite tools for expressing, especially like leftist or socialist ideas, because like literature allows you to get to these concepts that you might dream about, but you don't really see enacted in the world around you. And I think that that's kind of an amazing thing that literature can do, is sort of dream up other possibilities, other ways of organizing society, other ways of solving problems, and it can really connect with people on such an individual level. You know, I don't know if literature is really capable of like fomenting a revolution all by itself, but I do think it is capable of changing people's minds on an individual writer to reader level. Even if that change is not quantifiable or measurable, it is something that like I really believe in.
That's so interesting. I totally agree. I think like writing is still a very, very old technology. It's still the best technology we have for communicating, the mass communication of complex ideas.
Yeah.
Quickly. You know, like it's much quicker to read a book than it is to listen to an audiobook, for example. Like most people can read much faster than they can listen.
Yes.
And you can have a complexity. So if your idea is, I don't know, something quite simple, like buy the soap, perhaps television or the internet, TikTok is a better way to communicate that idea. But for complex ideas, like you're saying, self-help or leftist social studies, writing is still kind of unchallenged is the best technology for that purpose, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that, like, you know, I mean, when we look at like art forms that have maybe been somewhat displaced by TV or movies or the internet or whatever, I don't think those art forms go away because, I mean, the reason they've stuck around so long in the first place is that they engage with something like primal in us. Like, you know, sure, if you look at live theater, for example, like maybe not so many people are going to plays as like used to be the case, you know, a century ago, 2 centuries ago. But I don't really see theater as something that will ever like fully disappear from our society because it just like it feeds some hunger for like face-to-face art, you know, that whether that is playing out in like a community theater, high school drama class, whatever, like I don't think that part of us has ever gone away. And I think even if, you know, the number of readers like dwindles, I think the same is going to be true, maybe even like more true of literature, because I think people do have that like hunger for the written word. I mean, the biggest danger really is like literacy rates and like having like a literate population. And I think that that's part of why like education comes so much under attack, like in fascist regimes, because they know that a population that reads is a population that is going to be like more dangerous to them.
I agree. No, I totally agree. I think it's easy to be very doom and gloom, but I think if you actually look at the statistics as well, like people are buying a lot of books.
Yeah.
Like more books than ever in some ways. And maybe that's because people are buying 5 different special editions of the same fantasy book. I don't know. But that's not even necessarily a bad thing, but it's not, I don't know the specific details for the literature that you and I are trying to buy, that you and I are trying to foster. But in general, people are buying a lot of books. People are buying a lot of kind of pop non-fiction. People are buying a lot of kind of genre fiction more than ever. And I think that's, we can be too kind of pessimistic about it sometimes, I think. Like,
yeah, I agree.
Generally, it's still a very popular technology, a very popular way to spend your time, is to read. Very, very popular.
And I think people have a passion for literature in a way that they don't for YouTube videos. I mean, I love YouTube videos too, and I love films. And I mean, there's loads of people who love film and the theatre and stuff, and all different art forms. And that's what kind of differentiates, content from art. And one of the many things that differentiate content from art is the passion that people have for it.
Yes.
And that is, I think, a very strong force in literature.
Definitely. And I mean, I totally agree that like people are still reading. And I think that there's going to continue to be a large sort of core audience for books that is going to continue, you know, regardless. I'm honestly, I'm not really like that worried about AI coming from my job. I mean, maybe if I was focused on a different kind of writing, like I would be. But at the end of the day, I think that like you're always going to have people that really crave long form writing that written by, you know, a human person that crave that like human to human connection through literature.
I agree. It's not like there was that many jobs to begin with.
Right. Exactly. I'm like, I don't know,
3 people.
The situation as far as like jobs in literature is already like pretty. So
yeah, we're all doing it for free anyway. So AI is more expensive than us.
Yeah.
We're free. No.
Exactly.
Oh, amazing! What a wonderful chat. Thank you so much for allowing us to steal so much of your time, and thank you so much for sending us such a wonderful piece and allowing us to publish it. It's really an amazing piece, one of my favorites for this edition. And I'm allowed to have my favorites as an editor. I think it's so yeah, I really appreciate it. You know, it's been a really wonderful chat. I think it's been really lively, really interesting, and so yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for publishing the piece. This was a lot of fun and a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your time.
Amazing. Well then, I guess now I think it's time for me to say goodbye. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to read Caio's piece, it's available on our website at readingintoculture.com, and we will have a new podcast episode discussing all of the pieces in our spring 2026 edition, and with an episode every Sunday. So don't go anywhere. Sit there and wait until next Sunday, and then watch it, and then wait again until next Sunday, and then probably like go to the toilet and drink, but then wait again. Bye.
Bye.